Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much all for coming. The turnout today is great, so it's really good to see so many faces. I'm Maria. I'm president of the Energy and Environment Policy Centre at the King's think tank. I'm just going to briefly talk, and I know some of my friends might be worried, but I'll keep it brief. I'm going to introduce the think tank and introduce our speakers and then pass on the floor. So the King's think tank is the largest student-led policy in Europe. We've got 3,000 subscribers to our society, and there's a lot of ways through which you guys can get involved. So come to our events, but also you can join via the KCLSU website or through our own website, kingsthinktank.org. And you can always email us, and we always employ people. We always open more committee members. So if you really want to get involved and really want to make an impact, dead easy, just contact anyone from the society and get involved. Right, so today we're going to be talking about energy security. And we've got 4 speakers that I'm going to introduce right now. So first of all, we've got Malcolm Key. Malcolm works at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, but he has a lot of experience with energy before. Malcolm has worked in both the public sector, for example, as the Director of Energy Policy at the DTI, the private sector, as a Senior Managing Consultant at Oxera, and the non-profit sector at the World Coal Institute. And he has also been Special Advisor to the House of Lords Committee Inquiry into Energy Security, and Director of the Energy and Climate Change Study for the World Energy Council. Then we've got Jonathan Church. Jonathan is an environmental lawyer for Climate Earth. He focuses on climate and energy legislation, and he has a particular focus on the Climate Change Act. Prior to this, Jonathan has worked in research and campaigning roles for EU-related NGOs. Then we've also got Catherine Early, who is the Deputy Editor of The Environmentalist, and she specializes in energy and environmental issues. Since she has been a journalist in 2003, which is a long time ago, she has written... Sorry, I'm not the best public speaker, but I'm trying. Real Power, as well as The Guardian. And she helped start highly influential... Oh yeah, sorry. I'm so sorry, your name... So sorry, Danny.
Yeah, do it again.
I do know that. I'm just gonna... How do I make this presentation?
From right corner? Yeah, that, no. From current slide.
Found it. There we go. And Danny, who has helped start highly influential campaigns such as the UK Uncut, Move Your Money, and No Dash for Gas. And as the UK divestment coordinator for 350.org, she helps run campaigns against fossil fuel sponsorship, and we'll be talking more about that tonight. Now, apologize for all my mistakes, so I think I'm going to pass on, thankfully, the floor to Rianne, who's probably going to be a lot better. And she's going to talk a little bit about the King's Sustainability, whose our event is joint with the King's Sustainability, and then we're going to leave the floor to the speakers. Thank you so much. Hope you have a great event.
Right, so this is a joint event with King's Sustainability, and I know not many of you might have heard of us before. We are a staff team based in estates and facilities, and we operate to cover many aspects around King's, such as waste, energy, carbon, water. So we're managing all utility bills and trying to achieve a recycling target. So we're trying to reduce it by 70% and carbon emissions by 43%. So we've got some big targets, and obviously we want all of you to get involved and help us out with them. So how can you do that? We have a few ways that you can help us get involved and try and help us reach these targets, but also try and make a more sustainable environment around King's. So one of these is you can volunteer with us, and that can be done through KCLSU. That will help you towards your volunteer award. It's also a great CV booster. If you're looking to do that, just go onto their website or get in touch with us. A few other things you can do is attend our events, which are like this, and it's great to get some information about. Write for our blog, which is blogs kcl.ac.uk/sustainability, or you can just get in touch with any of your ideas. We hold an annual event called Green Week in February next year. If you have any ideas or any of your society would like to get involved with it, please just get in contact. And this is how you can get in touch with us. So through our Facebook page, Twitter, email, or blog. So I'm not going to bore you anymore with any of our kind of advertising things. We're just going to get on to the event. So if you want to come to that one. Yep.
So, hello again. Yes, I think we can call Jonathan.
Yeah, should I speak?
He's just
Yeah, either way, you can, whatever you want.
Maybe I'll go
Yeah,
back.
perfect.
Would be easy. Good evening, everyone. Many thanks for the invite. Just by way of introduction, I'm from Client Earth. Client Earth is a legal NGO. We're a bit like a Greenpeace or a WWF, but we try and use the law to affect change. That's our kind of USP, and so I myself am a lawyer, and apologies in advance, I'll be focusing primarily on the legal aspects as I see them, and particularly on the legal aspects of the climate goals, of the clean energy part of the question. I don't know to what extent everyone's familiar with the idea of the energy union. This is what at EU level at the moment is being discussed in terms of setting goals for 2030. And one of the things which is different about setting the goals for 2030 as compared with 2020 is that the climate goals will come within this broader energy union structure. And I think in general that's not a problem. After all, climate goals are part of the trilemma, and it makes sense for everything to be dealt with together under the energy union umbrella. But as always with environmental concerns, the question is whether it's a better thing to have the environmental concerns kind of in a separate place. Traditionally, there's an argument as to whether you should have, your environmental ministry, which really cares about the environment, but then maybe has little influence over other ministries of state, or whether it's better to try and integrate environmental concerns throughout. Often, of course, environmental concerns struggle to be heard in either context. So in principle it makes sense, I think, to integrate climate goals within the energy union, but we need to be cautious to make sure that the climate goals aren't subsumed within that larger, within those larger aims. I think if anything, personally, it's not surprising from my background that if anything climate goals should be prioritised at the moment. Out of the three areas of the trilemma, affordability, security and climate, it's climate that we have a real kind of pressing time concern over. So if anything, I think that should be prioritised. And I think if you bring everything together, there's a concern, as we see in the UK at the moment, the government's priorities are affordability, affordability and affordability, and then climate goals are left behind. To talk more specifically about the law, I'm just going to say a few words about the importance of the law. And when I'm talking about the law, I'm talking about a specific kind of climate framework law. This is not the kind of law which governments use, as they would normally with law, to get things done so much, as a law which sets out targets which governments then have to follow. And perhaps the best example of a climate framework law of this kind is the UK Climate Change Act, which is what I work on. This sets 80% target for 2050, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, that is, and it also sets 5-yearly rolling targets for reducing emissions. So I just thought I could perhaps share some of the lessons I think we can learn from the UK context and what's good about the Climate Change Act, and how that might influence the new suite of framework climate laws that we have at the EU level for 2030. So the first thing I would say is how important it is to have your climate targets in law. It might sound obvious, but the rule of law really means something. It persists, it's not political, and governments don't like to breach the law. At least they don't like to be seen to breach the law. And it's also important to have a binding law. And we see what binding actually means is actually something that can be discussed, but the mere understanding in the UK context that the targets are binding gives them real weight. And we notice that the Climate Change Act is often underpinning debate. We know that we have this 2050 target to reduce emissions by 80%, and because it's in a binding form, that has real weight in debate. We also want to have long-term visibility, and part of the problem that we have at the EU level when we come to make targets is that at the moment we're doing it periodically. We have targets to 2020, and when they were set, that was the end goal. And now we're revisiting it, and we're trying to come up with targets for 2030 and what the governance structure should be for 2030. And the problem with doing it bit by bit is that they're not seen as staging posts on a long-term trajectory. but they're seen as end goals in themselves, and there's a lack of investor certainty, there's a lack of visibility as to where we'll end up. And you can contrast that with the UK example, where we have that 2050 goal, and we know that we'll get there come 2050, so investors have that certainty. The final thing which I'd just like to stress in terms of what law must be in setting these targets is that the targets are only the start of the problem, the start of the solution, I should say. What we need, and the devil is in the detail, beneath those targets you need something in the law which then drives progress towards meeting those targets. And we have quite a lot of this in the Climate Change Act in the UK, where the government has to show what its plans are, it has to report annually, the Climate Change Committee has to report annually. A lot of this is done transparently. But still, even under the Climate Change Act, where we have targets to 2025, we're behind where we should be for meeting those targets. And the lesson that I draw from that is that what we need at the EU level is stronger than what we have at even in the Climate Change Act. We need to have a planning and reporting structure which drives progress, whereby member states must produce plans, they must report them on certain timescales, and they can be held accountable if those plans aren't good enough, and they have to be updated regularly, and if they become obsolete, then they need to be refined. And unfortunately, what we see at the EU level in the current debate is that we're likely to see the planning and reporting structure, this is what will drive achievement of the 2030 targets. It's likely to be non-binding in nature, and it's likely to be not very transparent either. And there's a slight irony in the UK government, which is a big champion of the Climate Change Act. It's one of the member states which is arguing, perhaps successfully, to kind of roll back from the binding nature of planning and reporting at the EU level. And similarly, we see the EU in the 2030 package rolling back from having binding targets. In 2020, we had binding targets for greenhouse gas emissions, for renewable energy and for energy efficiency. When it comes to 2030, we're only going to have binding targets for greenhouse gas as a whole and not for energy efficiency or renewable energy. So there's a concern there. One positive note is that in bringing everything together in 2030 within Energy Union, the system of planning and reporting may be streamlined, and that will reduce the burden on member states. So it may mean that we get better compliance with the legal requirements. But ultimately, we need the Commission, not only in drawing up these planning and reporting frameworks, to be committed, but also in enforcing them once they're in place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I think we're going to have all the speakers talk first and then have questions at the end. So I think Danny, is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. I don't have any slides.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's kind of interesting looking at the first line of the debate about energy supplies dwindling, and it's so funny because I just never think of it like that, because obviously energy doesn't run out and renewable energy is infinite. That's the whole point and one of the reasons why it's so great. And actually the problem that we're facing with energy is that we just get a lot from fossil fuels, and actually we've got 5 times more fossil fuels already in the fossil fuel industry's reserves than we would ever be able to burn and not completely cook ourselves. So yeah, it was kind of interesting having that that framing. So yeah, so I work for 350. We're an American kind of environmental NGO about building kind of grassroots people power to take on the climate crisis. And yeah, the biggest challenge we face is keeping fossil fuels in the ground. And I guess we see this problem and keeping them in the ground quickly enough that we can kind of survive. And I guess over the years, so you know, we've been talking about climate change and doing something about it since before I was born. At an EU level, this has been going on a long time. And one of the biggest problems we're facing is that one of the biggest barriers is the fossil fuel industry itself. Because doing something about climate change means leaving 80% of the fossil fuel industry's reserves in the ground. And these are reserves that are already factored into their share price. So doing something about climate change is an existential challenge to this industry. It's kind of, you have one or the other, at the moment you can't have both. And this is the most powerful and wealthy industry the world has ever seen. So that kind of puts the challenge that we're facing and why we're not getting anywhere quite as quickly as we need to, just in a bit of context. So who here has heard of the divestment campaign? A few people. Okay. So divestment is the opposite of investment, and it's about purposefully retracting your investments in an industry based on ethics. So it's about saying, I distance myself from this industry because what they are doing is fundamentally wrong. And we've seen really successful divestment campaigns around tobacco, around arms, around Darfur, and around the racist apartheid regime in South Africa. And the divestment campaign, although it's about kind of finance, it's kind of not really about money, in a sense. Like, we're not trying to bankrupt this industry financially, but we are trying to break their political power. This is about changing the way we think about the fossil fuel industry and kind of doing the same thing that the tobacco divestment campaign did to big tobacco, which was kind of making them, you know, public enemy number one and taking away their kind of political license to influence a lot of decisions that we need them not to be influencing if we get the best outcome for all of us rather than just for them. So the divestment campaign is about calling on kind of institutions in our society, our universities, our faith groups, our health groups, our local government, everyone, to publicly distance themselves from the fossil fuel industry because of what they are doing, which is, you know, very knowledgeably kind of destroying all of our futures. It's the fastest growing divestment movement the world has ever seen, according to an Oxford study. And we've seen some really, really amazing progress in the UK so far. Glasgow was the first university in the whole of Europe to divest. We've had movement from the Church of England, the British Medical Association that represents all of our doctors, have all committed to divest, and several local governments, and things are really starting to pick up. In September last year, they kind of totted up all of these divestment commitments, and they had 181 institutions with an asset base of 50 billion. They did that this year in September. That is now a total of $2.6 trillion, that asset base. That's grown over 50 times in just 1 year. That's pretty cool. So it's really gaining momentum, and I think, as someone who's been involved in the environmental movement for a while, it's one of the most exciting things that's happening at the moment, and we're really seeing some traction and some successes. And just to talk a bit about why I think it's working. The first reason is because I think it's simple. If it's wrong, I guess the tagline is, if it's wrong to wreck the planet, which it is, well then it's definitely wrong to profit from that wreckage. And while, you know, King's College is profiting from the destruction of the environment, we should be asking some questions. And you know, all of us that understand climate change, it's simple: if you don't like it, don't pay for it. So the divestment message is very clear and people get it. It's also good because it speaks to the power dynamics in the situation that's going on. This is an enormous challenge, this is a big battle, and it's about kind of going directly to the root of the problem and kind of challenging the industry head on, which I think is really important and inspiring for all of us who can see the nature of this problem and are fed up with being told to turn our lights off, because that's not going to do it. Past successes, there have been really successful divestment campaigns in the past, so we've got history to look at. And that's really important to know, that this tactic can work and it can change the power dynamics in this situation. Fourthly, the financial argument. So this is the really interesting bit about the divestment campaign, and actually where the divestment campaign came from, which was financial analysts from London saying, hang on a minute, if these industries are worth this much, but 80% of their goods are worthless, well, that's a terrible investment. You wouldn't invest in a company that had to leave 80% of its merchandise in the warehouse. You just wouldn't do that. And increasingly, the financial warnings about is this a good industry to be invested in are coming clearer and clearer. And Mark Carney from the Bank of England came out with some very helpful statements just a few weeks ago saying, yeah, this carbon bubble, this question of, this is a real question of like actual global financial instability. It's quite a big shout from the old governor. And Carbon Tracker are the really pioneering NGO that have been behind a lot of that, and they are really great. And finally, I think it works because it's decentralised, and this campaign has kind of caught fire all around the world and continues to snowball. And I think it's because it's decentralised. So anyone, anywhere can pick up this campaign and run with it and do it. And we've just seen that all over the world. And it really gives us a chance to lead where it feels that governments are failing us. Which brings me nicely onto the fact that there's a really cool divestment campaign at King's itself. And I kind of recognise some of you guys in the audience, and it's a really amazing campaign that they've been going for a couple of years, and starting to make progress. I guess it would be good to hear a bit more about where the kind of review of the finances is at the moment, because how much have King's got invested in fossil fuels? Do you know?
At least 8 million.
At least 8 million. There we go. 8 million in the fossil fuel industry. That's no good. So yeah, I guess I would end on just that climate change is the biggest global challenge that the world has ever faced. And as Obama says, we are the first generation to feel the effects. We are the last that can do anything about it. Time is really, really running out on this. And particularly as a kind of young person, and it's us, it's our kids who will see these effects. It's really important to act. So in terms of policy recommendations, which is, I understand, kind of some of the stuff that the think tank does, get this university divested. Join the hundreds of other universities around the world that are taking a stand and saying this is completely amoral, that an education institution that is preparing the younger generations for the future is paying for it to be destroyed. So that would be my policy recommendation to all of you. Obviously, as many of you will know, there's the big climate talks coming up in Paris in like 2 weeks' time now, and this is a really important moment for us all to get out and mobilise and say, look, we really care about this, this is really important. There's a big march going on in London on the 29th. And then in Paris itself, we're going to get loads of people there, it's going to be raucous. And December the 12th is the biggest, just as the talks are closing, and it's really important that we're there to say, as the negotiations close, if you've crossed these red lines, we are civil society and we are saying this is not good enough and we will be back. So yeah, D12, look it up. Big deal, actually. Thanks.
Thank you so much. If you have slides, just go below your name. Hi everyone, I'm Catherine Early. I'm Deputy Editor of The Environmentalist, which you may not have heard of, but we're the magazine of IEMA, which is the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. We have a website as well. I've been covering energy issues for a very long time, so yeah. Various magazines aimed at all kinds of policymakers and people in various industries. So I wanted to talk to you today about how sort of media coverage of energy issues possibly skews the public debate a bit, and sometimes is a bit misleading. Some headlines you may have seen recently about whether we're about to have blackouts this winter. So there's a few of them. Blackout risk rises as UK energy crisis deepens, from the Telegraph. Pricey winter blackouts loom as government prepares for biggest power risk for a decade. Winter blackout fear as reserves run low. Osborne's green tax is blamed for power supplies falling to danger level, from thisismoney.co.uk. And slightly more balanced, electricity margins manageable, says National Grid amid blackout fears, Daily Mail. So these came from National Grid's annual report. Does this every year as we're going into winter, just to update people on what supplies are looking like going for that
for the winter ahead and how much of a sort of buffer there is in case sort of extremely cold weather or something goes wrong somewhere. And it says, our analysis suggests that electricity margins will continue to be tight but manageable throughout the winter period. And for gas, it says, we expect that the UK will be well supplied this winter. So that's not quite what the headlines were suggesting, with a sort of alarmist words like danger and fear and blackout and so on. So looking at Ofgem, which is the energy regulator, they also had a report out recently, and they said that risks to security of supply for 2015 to 16 have been effectively brought within the level implied by the government's reliability standard, which is basically saying it's all going to be fine. So this is a bit odd. Now, where did the papers get all those headlines from? So there's an organisation called the Energy and Climate Change Intelligence Unit, which some of you may know. It's a good organisation, set up quite recently to just sort of bring some facts into the energy and climate debate. They actually did a study on this, looking at over sort of newspaper stories for the last decade and what they've been saying about energy blackouts, and they said they found only over 500 stories covering this issue, saying that the lights would go out, you know, imminently that winter, fairly soon. But when they looked into it, they found only one example of a power cut associated with power generation in the whole of those 10 years. Obviously there are power cuts, but they're also associated with local distribution problems like extreme weather, or someone's cut through a power line by accident or something like that. This incident where it did happen apparently was in 2008, and there was a nuclear station and I think it was a coal power station. They went offline at about the same time, and this caused a problem for about 500,000 people for approximately 20 minutes. So not particularly dramatic. So the guy who's the director of this organisation, Richard Black, he's a former BBC environment correspondent, and he says 10 years of crying wolf on power cuts has probably served only to confuse the public, who will be entirely aware that their lights have stayed on. So that was his conclusion on this. So we come back to where these stories came from. This graph was using the National Grid data, but done by Carbon Brief, which is also another good website. And as you can see, this is showing the sort of amount of energy buffer, the amount of buffer there is sort of in case things go wrong. So 2015-16, it's just over 5%. So if you compare that to 5 years ago, then yeah, it's massively lower than it was. But then if you use the data over 10 years, it's a lot higher, and the lights didn't go out then either. So you know, you have to look at if people are using data a bit selectively sometimes to sort of back up this case. And I mean, there's a lot of MPs who are constantly talking about lights going out in business groups and so on, who are sort of against various energy policies, so it is used quite a lot in that way. Something wrong there. Luckily I've printed out. Yeah, there's a guy called Michael Grubb, who's Professor of International Energy and Climate Change Policy at Imperial College, and he said, I'm not sure there's any other area of policy with quite such a large gap between perception and reality as the sort of energy security in the UK. Now I'm going to talk about shale gas, which as one journalist I know called it the gift that keeps on giving. There's always some kind of drama associated with stories about shale gas. It's caused earthquakes, there's YouTube videos of fire coming out of people's taps in the US. A Tory peer managed to insult the entire of the north of England by saying it should be fracked. You know, all this kind of thing. There's always something dramatic, so it's quite a good one for journalists to pick up on. The government set up an independent task force to look into shale gas, sort of responding to the public's concerns on it, and they've been producing a series of reports on various different issues. One they came out with a couple of months ago was, there were quite a lot of headlines, out about regulation and how this report was saying that regulation needed to be stronger and in the UK wasn't good enough and this kind of thing. I got a press release from one NGO that said the following quote: "The report also confirms what we've been saying. Despite reassuring words from government and industry desperate to get fracking, UK regulations are not tough enough." So I thought, oh, this sounds interesting, let's see what the report says about regulation. And it turns out it didn't actually say that much. It did have the following paragraph. It is worth noting that, in the task force opinion, current regulations in the UK do serve this purpose, as in to stop pollution, and on the whole are more rigorous and robust than those in operation in the US, which is important because a lot of people have been using examples of what's happened in the US to show why the UK shouldn't do it. But it's a different country, so it's not directly comparable. So, again, where did the story came from? There was a quote in the press release that says, from the chair of this task force, says, "Only if drilling is done properly and to the highest standard and with rigorous regulation and monitoring can shale gas fracking be done safely for local communities and the environment." So I think this has just been a bit taken out of context because he's just stating the obvious really, which is saying that shale gas can't be safe if you don't have tough regulation. That's not the same as saying the UK's regulations are not strong enough. It doesn't actually say that. So yeah, I actually asked the NGO where it came from. I went back to them and asked them why they put that quote out, because I thought maybe I've missed something here. But they just sent me, they said, well, the PR said he hadn't actually read it himself, but he sent me a BBC report that said there should be more regulation, rather than taking me back to the actual report. So, sometimes you get the media sort of in a hurry to kind of come out with things and they sort of feed off each other a little bit and start using each other as evidence instead of going back to the source, which isn't great, but it does happen. So, yeah, and at the other extreme you get the government then comes out with stuff about we need shale gas to keep the lights on, it's going to create thousands of jobs, so on and so on, which isn't really true either. So we get these two extremes of opinion, and what's really happened, I've noticed since I've been covering shale gas, is that I started covering it just before the protests in Balkan, which you're probably aware of a couple of years ago, and before then it was quite easy to ring up professionals who were involved in the industry or consultants working on things, planners, lawyers, so on, who are the sort of people that I talk to as a journalist, writing for that kind of audience, and they would talk to you quite openly about it. Since then, they just won't talk to you. And I think that's a real shame because there's a lot to be said about shale gas. I'm not saying that it's a great idea or anything. I just think that the debate isn't really being properly, it's not being properly debated because you've got a big chunk of people in the middle who don't want to talk about it. So yeah, that's really just a couple of examples of things that happen in the media that might not necessarily be that helpful. And that's it really.
Thank you very much. Malcolm?
Maria.
Thanks, good evening. I don't think I need to introduce myself because that's already been done. I don't really need to introduce my institute because it does what it says on the tin. It's an institute at Oxford that does energy studies. What I'm going to talk about is basically the issues that are raised in this sort of the brief for this presentation, focusing on the energy union. But unlike Jonathan, I'll be looking mainly at policy, not at the legal aspect of it. I don't know if you can read that or not, but just to say that the energy union is actually a much bigger idea than the 2030 goals. It's got very, very ambitious objectives. It wants to achieve a fundamental transformation of Europe's energy system, leading to a sustainable, low-carbon and climate-friendly economy. And I won't go through it all, but it's talking about changing away from the old centralised supply-side model, empowering consumers, all that sort of thing. It's really, highly ambitious stuff. The question is Europe equipped to do this? Which is, frankly, somewhat doubtful. Now, there has been a long history. I'm not going to go through the next group of slides. I guess you're not mostly European experts, but Europe's been trying for a long time to do something in energy, never really quite achieved it. Some things have gone right, some things have gone wrong. There have been problems. What I'm going to focus on is what the challenges are now in terms of some of the parts of the energy union. Now, something that's slightly odd about the way the energy union is working is now, one of their objectives is to do with technology, because that's an important part of the transition they're talking about, developing new technology. And they're also talking about a fairly fundamental change in the way they're approaching R&D. In the past, R&D has been very technology specific. You know, you've been looking at, say, carbon capture and storage, particular technologies. Europe's realised that doesn't really work in itself, partly because you might choose the wrong technology, but also because you might create a technology that doesn't really have a market there for it. What they're trying to do is to take a more integrated systems approach. Now that makes a lot of sense. The funny thing is, they haven't really done that on the other side, on the deployment side. Most deployment, as you know, is still technology-based through feed-in tariffs or obligations for renewables, for developing renewables, and then each country is going its own way. They've all got different systems, they've all got different approaches, they've all got different technology preferences. So you've got the very odd position just now that Germany is moving out of nuclear at the same time that the UK is moving into nuclear. That's creating problems which may not be ones that worry us here so much, but are creating problems across Europe, because all the movement of power across Europe is essentially being driven not by markets, which is what Europe wants, but by technology choices. If you look in particular perhaps at the right-hand chart, you can see how Germany's exports of power have been really soaring in recent years. That's because they've built so much wind and solar power that at certain times of day they have a huge surplus. Now some of the countries who get it quite like it, like the Netherlands, because it's very cheap. Some of the countries who get it, like Poland, don't like it. Because it messes up their system, it backs out their coal, and it's quite difficult to manage. So what you're doing is these individual national policy decisions are creating problems for the single market. But there's a more fundamental problem, and I think this is the only bit where I get quite techie, so apologies to those who are not really into the economics. But electricity markets today are based on kilowatt hours, which in terms of generation is short-run marginal cost pricing. That's the whole way electricity wholesale markets are operated. It's the way electricity is sold to you per kilowatt hour. That doesn't really make sense as we move towards renewable sources. They are basically capital cost sources. There's no marginal cost. Once the wind farm is there, it costs virtually nothing for it to produce power. Once the solar panel's there, the cost is not of producing power. So this whole marginal cost pricing basis in the wholesale and retail markets really doesn't work. And if you're following this at all, you'll know that there's been lots of sort of stuff happening in Europe. A lot of European utilities are basically going bankrupt. You may not worry about that as such, but there could be problems down the line when that happens. Government, however, is also introducing some sort of emergency payments. In the UK, we've got a capacity market now developed, which you may have heard about, which is producing quite counterintuitive and, frankly, not very helpful results. Most of the plants that won contracts in that capacity market, at least the new plants, were diesel. And that's crazy. We shouldn't be building diesel plants now. It doesn't make sense from an environmental point of view, but that's the way the market works. So the whole thing is really rather a mess. The Commission sort of recognises this and says we need to redesign the electricity market, but its own proposals are frankly pretty weak. They don't go very far. And the funny thing is, another part of the Commission, DG Ecofin, that's the economic and finance bit, has come forward with a fairly good analytical paper saying there's a real problem here. We have to change electricity markets pretty fundamentally. But DG Energy, which is the one who's doing the basic market redesign, isn't really responding to this. And I'm not sure how much it's meant, but DG Ecofin says, look, we have to start thinking about this now because of, quotes, the inertia of the energy system. And I think they're really saying the inertia of DG Energy and the energy departments and the energy industry itself. Really, this is an area where change is needed, and it's quite difficult for the industry to accept that need, or governments. A second area that really needs to be thought much more about is the demand side. As far as Europe is concerned, and frankly as far as most ministerial rhetoric is concerned, the demand side is about energy efficiency. I mean, they go on about it being Europe's biggest energy resource, about it being the main focus of demand side and so on. When you think about it, if you're trying to achieve the fundamental transformation that Europe's talked about, demand side, energy efficiency is only a small part of what you want on the demand side. The things you want on the demand side, if you're going to affect that transformation, are firstly, reducing demand for high carbon energy. Secondly, encouraging switching to low carbon sources. Thirdly, and very importantly, encouraging flexibility in demand. And finally, something that in a sense complements other decarbonisation measures. And just to explain that a bit, at the moment energy efficiency, if it works, essentially undermines the emission trading scheme. If it reduces demand, the carbon price goes down. And you've got the same with the renewable support. Insofar as they work, the emissions go down, so the carbon price goes down. So you've got all the main arms of European energy policy pulling in different directions. And you've got demand side being basically undeveloped. Yet one of the purposes of the whole change is to empower consumers to bring the demand side in. So that's another area where they need to do something. They recognise that at some level of theory. They're talking about citizens taking ownership of the energy transition, being empowered and so on. But in their actual proposals, there's hardly anything. There's just things like more information, smart grids and so on. There is a very sort of half-hearted approach to a challenge which they admit is an extraordinarily fundamental one. They really want to achieve a fundamental transition, and they're coming up with steady as she goes sort of proposals. Similarly, in the area of what I call market-friendly measures, their flagship, they call it their flagship, is the emissions trading scheme. Yet, those of you who know the emissions trading scheme know it simply doesn't work. The price in the emissions trading scheme has consistently for the past few years been below about 10 euros. The implicit price of carbon in the carbon support measures like the feed-in tariffs is about 100 euros or more. The UK government's own estimate of the social cost of carbon is about £70 or £75, which again is around 100 euros. So you've got a price for carbon and a measure either of the social cost of carbon or of the incentives needed to introduce low carbon measures, which is an order of magnitude different. It's not a policy which I think is going to work. The Commission is coming out with all sorts of clever ideas to fiddle around with it at the edges. But basically what they do is reduce the credibility of the system. It's going to be very difficult, and indeed nearly everyone involved in the industry and so on has said that, for anyone to make a long-term investment on the basis of the emissions trading scheme. Looking at security, most of us think of security, I think, the wrong way around. We think of it, or a lot of people think of security the wrong way around. They think of it as those nasty people outside, the Middle Eastern oil producers or Russia or whatever. And that was the starting point for the Energy Union. Donald Tusk, who was then Prime Minister of Poland, wanted to set up a collective purchasing agreement for Russian gas. But actually, the Commission, the Europe in general, doesn't really have any policy for that. It used to have a policy. The policy was, we'll ask everyone in the world to sign up to European rules. They had something called the Energy Charter Treaty, which they said, which was aimed at Russia. And they said, well, if Russia signs that and follows the same rules as us, then everything's all right. And they've been mounting campaigns on Gazprom and others, trying to get them essentially to unbundle systems and so on in the same way that Europe has. But that basically doesn't work. You can't control what's happening outside your borders. What we think should happen is much more focused on what's happening internally. It's things like storage, better markets, better interconnections, more diversity and so on, but very, very importantly, the sort of demand-side flexibility that I've mentioned. And if I could sort of slightly defend the press here, the recent press reports on lights going out were not completely baseless. They were based on, I mean, these things are developing in the UK, and they were based on the national grid in the UK having issued what's called a NISM, a Notice of Inadequate Supply Margin. That is a notice that supplies are tight. And this was a notice to industrialists who'd signed up for one of these demand-side deals that you might be asked to cut your demand. There's nothing, absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's a way of balancing supply and demand. It's part of what the future should be. So the problem really is not so much, I think, saying there was a problem when there wasn't. There was a notice of an inadequate supply margin. The problem was not understanding that asking people to cut demand is part of the response to that. not a sign that things are out of control. I won't say much about governance because Jonathan's already covered that. Basically, there is very little governance for the EU system. What Europe thinks is going to happen is it's going to go round, and the Commission is going to go round and talk to all the countries in Europe, look at their energy plans and say that's not good enough, you must do better. And I think what most of the countries in Europe, like the UK, think is, well, we're going to tell Europe what we're doing and then they can go away because we know what we're doing is the right thing. It's very difficult to see how that's going to move forward. Probably the Commission is going to try and get stronger powers in this area. It's difficult to see, though, where that one will go. So, just to summarise, I think there are some policy areas where Europe could move forward. This is not to say it's going to achieve all this high-flown stuff that was in its original proposal. But the four key ones here are, firstly, reforming electricity markets, which is a bit techy, but it's actually more important than it looks. The whole of Europe's climate policy is based on electricity. It's based on first decarbonising electricity, then electrifying other sectors. Unless you can get that core of it right, you're simply not going to be able to do it. The second thing is getting your demand-side strategy properly developed, integrated into this, and explaining to the press. Explaining to the press, this is not a problem, this is the way in which we want to handle things because it's the most sensible way of handling things. Thirdly, because of the problems with the emissions trading scheme, think about new policy instruments in that area. I don't think the emissions trading scheme is ever really going to work. We've suggested another option of carbon intensity targets, but I think that there are other options available. The Commission does really need seriously to think about new instruments. This is, in a way, our way round the governance problem. If it can develop a new instrument, it doesn't have to worry about the problem that it doesn't have competence to a sufficient extent under the treaties. And finally, on energy security, taking a self-help approach rather than spending your whole time worrying about what foreigners may or may not do. Thank you.
I'd like to say thank you so much for all your speakers' inputs. I think it's great to have opinions from different experts and different sort of expertise. I think, so first of all, the King's think tank and the King's sustainability team have prepared some questions for you, so I think we're going to go ahead and ask those I'm going to ask them on your behalf, and then we might open to debate. So first of all, I've got a question for Malcolm, if I may. So what role do consumers have now, and should that change? Should consumers have a say in how their energy is sourced?
Yeah, basically. I mean, the way in which, in the past, at present, decarbonisation is operating is basically driven by the supply side. If you look at the amount of intervention across Europe, something like 70% of it is on the supply side in the form of things like support for renewables. Of the remaining part of it, staggeringly, about 20% is in the form of bringing down consumer prices through things like lower taxes for energy-intensive sectors and so on. That's crazy, and it runs against everything else. You've got about 10% for energy efficiency, which is not very much, and you've got basically nothing for demand response, for flexibility of demand. So I think that, in a sense, needs to be turned upside down. The whole policy balance needs to be restructured away from the supply side towards the demand side, really encouraging, and the Commission talks about this but hasn't really done it yet, things like community energy schemes, more power for individuals to make choices, to control their own supplies, and treating demand response as basically a much more flexible approach to demand, helping them in the way that you give support for producers. That the argument for support for producers is that they need guarantees of income because they're not sure they're going to be able to recover their costs. Well, similarly, on the consumer side, there are many things which consumers are uncertain about. They don't know how effective they're going to be. If they could have help with that, if there could be help with, for instance, feed-in tariffs for energy efficiency, for demand response measures, if those could then be integrated into a single package, it would make much more sense. So basically, as part of this fundamental transformation the Commission's talking about, it should be shifting the whole balance towards the demand side.
Thank you so much. One more question for you, if I may. How is the UK faring in comparison to the rest of Europe in relation to decarbonisation? And do we need a new approach, or are capacity markets enough?
Well, quite well, actually. I mean, I know we tend to decry ourselves, but carbon emissions have come down a lot. All I'd say is it's unclear how much of that is to do with government policy. In fact, if you look at the period from 1970 to 1990, before the UK had any policy, its carbon emissions came down by over 20%. Basically because people moved from gas to coal. It's come down a bit more than that since then, but the extent to which that's government policy, the extent to which it's, say, the dash to gas and power generation and various other things is unclear. But basically, the Climate Change Act has been quite successful. The UK has more or less kept up to it. Its renewables obligations, this remains to be seen, but the fact is that renewables growth in the UK has been very, very fast in recent years. Last year it was the fastest in Europe. The last quarter, this year, I think, for the first time renewables output was greater than, renewables use in generation was greater than use of coal in generation, so more actually from renewable sources. It is changing very fast, and I think although a lot of this is going back to measures taken by the previous government, I don't think the UK is doing quite as badly as some people might think.
Thank you. I was just wondering, Danny, do you have anything to comment, since you've been involved with No Dash for Gas?
Yeah. Well, I guess there's a huge amount of people that are really angry about fracking, and I guess that's kind of where I come at it from, and that it feels like a slightly red herring technology in many ways when it feels so expensive for such, and just kind of, if we want to decarbonise our entire electricity supply by 2030, and which is what the Commission on Climate Change says we need to do to meet our targets, and our current output from fracking won't be at anywhere near the level that it's expected to be until 2035. But it's well, that kind of.
I think that leads to my second question. Might be a little bit of devil's advocate, just to get the debate fruitful. But is Europe's energy security likely to be revolutionized by fracking, as in the USA? If fracking can offer the UK cheap fuel, is environmental cost going to be enough of an incentive for European governments to turn away from it?
I mean, I think so much has come out since then saying that fracking isn't going to be cheaper. There's no real, that was although it was initially put out there, although it has had a big effect in the US, the energy markets in Europe are very different, so it means that price comparison isn't the same, and it kind of no longer looks like this is going to be this cheap source of fuel, and it feels like, in the kind of work I do around, divestment, and we're talking about stranded assets, and no one invests in cassette players anymore because they're not very useful anymore because no one has cassettes, and I feel like investing in further fossil fuel technology is another kind of terrible example of bad forward planning, and actually we should be investing much more heavily in more sustainable technologies.
Thank you so much. Now my question for Catherine would be, is the British public being misled by biased news coverage about UK's energy security? And what about in other countries? Do they have with more restricted media?
I think in some cases, because there are definite biases on some newspapers, like the Telegraph hates wind power. It doesn't really matter what the story is, they'll twist it so that it means that wind power is evil and we shouldn't have it.
Do you know why?
Sorry? Do I know why? Mainly because their readers are the people who are, a lot of their readers live in the countryside in nice houses with fields that they don't want wind farms on. True. So there is that kind of thing. And I mean, I wrote something about I had some data on wind farms, and they took that data and then they sort of twisted it, so I mean the story came out as a total opposite. That's what I went as, but that didn't surprise me at all. But yeah, I mean that's just the way they look at things. But yeah, so there are some media outlets who will definitely have that bias, but generally it's not that they're trying to mislead the public in any way, or or anything like that. It's just that sometimes some of it's just down to the pressure of time and not having time to. They got the press release, they look at that and don't necessarily look at the whole report and see what it says. That's why I was really trying to show with that shale gas thing. Some of it's just not understanding things. Like, there is a lot, what you were saying was totally right about not understanding that it's okay to... businesses have actually signed up for this demand side response, and it doesn't involve massive disruption. They get paid for it, so they're doing okay. But there doesn't seem to be any comprehension of that, and sort of you get quite a lot of coverage of that being like, oh, it's terrible, they're going to have the businesses shutting down and all this kind of thing. As if it's like the blackouts, which I think really, was it in the 70s, and they had sort of rolling power blackouts and things. It's not about that. So, the market has been designed in that way, but also it's quite difficult to find out sometimes if you're under pressure as a journalist. There are specialist media on most newspapers have got specialist people on energy and climate who know a lot of stuff, but sometimes it'll be a different reporter who's covering it, doesn't necessarily know the background. And you can't get information out of government departments anymore. When I first started, we'd get invited to a government department, they'd give us off-the-record briefings with civil servants, and so that we understood they're like, this big policy's coming out, we want you to understand it so that you can explain it. And that sort of dwindled, and you just don't get that at all anymore. Just press conferences at government departments don't really happen. I think they just haven't got the resources, and a lot of the time journalists don't have time to go to them. So it's kind of, a sort of combination of things going on.
Thank you. And I've got one more question for Jonathan before we move into the floor. So, what legal challenges does Europe face in attempting to create sustainable energy security, and how can these barriers be overcome?
If it's all right, I'd just like to come back to something that Malcolm said about the UK and how it's doing on the Climate Change Act, and maybe try and take some of the gloss off it. I think the picture since the new government came into power, we've seen all kinds of renewable energy policies scrapped or ended prematurely. And like the Climate Change Act, I'm fairly policy neutral in the sense that it doesn't matter too much to me how you do it, but if you, without consultation or without prior warning, take a lot of what appear to be damaging policy decisions, then you hurt investor certainty and confidence. And we've seen, I think there was a recent report by Ernst & Young, attractiveness for renewable energy industries in the UK has dropped quite significantly this year. If you look at recent emissions have fallen a lot. Last year in the UK, I think they dropped something like 8%, which is fairly significant. But I think it's understood that the vast majority of that fall was because it was a mild winter and we didn't need to heat our homes so much. So I prefer to look more at kind of the underlying trends of where we're going and where our current policies are likely to take us. And I come back to the 2025 target that we have in the UK, which we've had since 2011, and this government and the last have consistently been behind progress in meeting that. And I think this is really a test of of how we're doing. I'm sorry, can you repeat? I wanted to answer my own.
With what legal challenges is Europe facing attempting to create sustainable energy security?
I think Malcolm has said a huge amount on that. Going back to what I said, from a legal perspective, I think one of the important things that Malcolm said was about community power and making sure that, yes, it's all right to have a free market of energy throughout Europe, and that's likely to be beneficial in all kinds of ways, but it needs to be a market that deals with the demand side, that allows community power and other good sources of power to flourish. And I think there's a real challenge when it comes to transparency as well, that the legal framework can be seen and understood and engaged with by civil society and others.
Thank you so much. Now I can open the floor. Questions? Yes?
I had a question about divestment that you were speaking about. I don't know the numbers very well, so this might be an uninformed question, but if you think about divesting your finances into a different industry, and which might be less lucrative, don't you then think that divesting might be something that's only a possibility for the rich and the wealthy, and institutions with a lot of money in that sense? Because if you have to divest into something that won't give you as much return, you have to shift your balances.
I mean, I guess there are a couple of things to think about, and I would say, firstly, that actually increasing studies are showing that actually portfolios without fossil fuels in are doing kind of just as well, sometimes better, as their kind of fossil fuel counterparts. And I think, almost more importantly, you know, historically fossil fuels have been incredibly lucrative, but actually in a carbon-constrained world, they're looking just much more financially risky, and there are a couple of reasons why. I mean, certain fuels like coal. I mean, coal is in, you know, according to Goldman Sachs, in terminal decline, because, you know, coal's just got to go, and so that's just not a sensible investment. And so there's more and more stuff coming out every day about the kind of financial risks associated with particularly coal, but more generally kind of the industry, and that's linked to a couple of things, and I guess the most important one is policy on climate change. And, you know, if we suddenly say you can't burn all the fossil fuels, well, that really changes stuff. But also, even if, you know, for people that aren't so confident in the process around whether we can do that, just the kind of rise in renewables is kind of one of the biggest things that's going to really shift that dynamic. And there are also other factors like the accessibility of and kind of physical stranding of assets because of extreme weather and stuff like that.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm interested in the critique of the emissions trading scheme. You argued that demand-side measures would reduce the effectiveness of the scheme. Do you see that as a critique you can apply to emissions trading schemes across the board in China or California, or is this specifically when you have multiple countries involved in one scheme?
It's a generic problem. It's one reason why sometimes carbon taxes are a better policy instrument, because, you know, they are what they are, whatever the level of demand is. I think it's particularly problematic in Europe because energy efficiency is, I mean, frankly, it's a bit of smoke and mirrors in Europe. What they mean by energy efficiency is demand being lower than your forecasts. Now, demand can be lower than your forecasts for 101 reasons. One is that your forecasts are wrong, and that's what's been happening in recent years. The forecast, and admittedly, this is going back to 2008, and I guess no one saw the recession coming, but the main reason why the ETS price is very low is it's not really energy efficiency as such, it's just demand being low because of the recession. The difficulty with that is, looking forward, that's probably always likely to be the case. There's a particular problem in Europe because the two biggest CO2 emitters, which is in Europe, which is the UK and Germany, actually have very ambitious targets, more ambitious than the European targets. And although, as Jonathan says, there's some doubts about it, actually the record is not bad. And if you look at what people were saying would happen 10 years ago, they've vastly overachieved, and it's likely that they will go on overachieving. Germany doesn't have a legal structure as such, but it does have a constant review mechanism, and it's doing that just now because of the withdrawal from nuclear. So it's likely that the big countries, the big emitters, are going to reduce emissions faster than is assumed under the overall European trading scheme. So I think there's a structural problem there. It's likely to arise anywhere. It's a particular problem, though, in a country, federations are wrong word, in a union like that of Europe, where there are a lot of different countries. So these numbers come out of a negotiation. In China, it will be much easier. In China, the central authority wouldn't be open to someone like Poland coming along. I mean, that's not an unfair example, but a country coming along, and it's just, you know, going back to game theory, I suppose. Each individual country wants to free ride. They want the highest level of emissions for their emitters and the lowest level of overall emissions. So they'll all be trying to get the highest level of emissions themselves. So you're always going to end up when you've got a group of countries like that with a higher level of emissions than you should really have. It's probably better in China, but it's still, I agree, it's a fundamental problem with all emissions trading schemes, that you're probably, because of the way the politics work, going to end up with too high a baseline, and therefore the price is going to be too low.
Let me just check the time. Okay, we'll have 2 more questions. I think you were first.
Thank you so much for your presentations, which I listened to with great interest. I would like to ask you probably a couple of questions. I'll just limit myself to one. Energy subsidies. We are currently witnessing the lowest prices of fossil fuels in the last energy subsidies are said to be a serious problem across the energy system. How do you see tackling this problem, this very moment of low oil prices, as helping to tackle the problem of climate change? And do you think that addressing energy subsidies may help?
I mean, in theory, low energy prices should be an opportunity, because the countries that have the largest subsidies, which are generally the big producers, the Venezuela, the Saudi Arabias of this world, where motor fuel costs in Venezuela about 5 cents a gallon. It's just incredibly cheap. The lower energy prices go, the easier it is to start moving towards energy prices. And there are some countries like Iran which have done that fairly successfully, because if you get your timing right and if you raise energy prices to world levels when prices are low, and then they start going up again, it's an advantage. So in some ways it works. In other ways it doesn't work, because the lower energy prices are, the more people resist any extra costs which they see as coming out of the decarbonisation process. So it's a bit half and half.
Go ahead.
With regards to the lack of transparency about legal frameworking and even the amount of information available to journalists, to what extent do you think that's a deliberate attempt to buy time and actually obscure facts, especially when we live in like a post-Westphalian society where attempts or the energy invested in attempts to sort of make policies work and be effective is actually held accountable to many more people and many more institutional organisations that are demanding results?
Maybe I'll say something about at the EU level. I think there's a lack of transparency at the moment as the 2030 climate goals are being negotiated and how the planning and reporting will work. And I think that is probably a consequence of the difficulties, the political difficulties of finding a solution, a way forward. There are, all the member states have as Malcolm says, their own positions, and the Commission is in a difficult position itself, trying to find a way of putting in place a legal framework which works, and there are legal constitutional difficulties as well that the Commission has to work with. So I think, unfortunately, it's to some extent it's something we often see at the European level, is that the tensions are such that it's easier to hide them. I don't know to what extent it's a kind of deliberate obfuscation, but just in the UK context, transparency is not so bad. The Climate Change Act requires a degree of transparency from government and from the Climate Change Committee, but it was interesting this week there was a leaked letter. I don't know if you saw that in the news. It was to do with the UK's progress towards its 2030 renewable energy targets. 2020, sorry, thanks, Mark. And publicly, it seemed at least that the government was saying that their plans were suggesting they would meet these targets, but privately there seems to be quite a different understanding. And so you can be transparent, but perhaps not fully disclosing everything.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Leading on from that, do you think that the government's custom feed-in tariffs was a failure or a choice to recognise this demand side of energy? And do you think after the Paris summits we're hoping that they'll be bound to reverse that and kind of recognise the demand side?
you're pretty optimistic if you think they're going to reverse it. I don't think it was anything to do with recognising the demand side, I'm afraid. I think it was basically, as you may know, the government has set a cap on the total amount it's going to spend under these sorts of schemes, which is quite high, 7.5 billion, but most of the money is taken up already. So they wanted to, to cut back some of the programmes which they thought were less important. And I agree with what Jonathan said earlier. It's very bad for investment if these schemes change all the time. But I'm afraid I think it's not really so much affordability that's the government's watchword, it's cutting costs. Because these things count through a very rather complex, even though electricity consumers pay it, they count as public spending under the rules, and so it's problematic for the government. And that's what they're trying to do just now in this age of austerity, to cut back. So I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic about seeing anything much. The most that might come out of Paris from the government's point of view, which in a way might be a good thing, is the definitive end for coal in the UK. Because basically it's dying anyway, and it's always a good thing for governments to do, to take credit for something that's on the way out, and say, here's our offer to the world, we'll be the first country that says it will stop using coal. So.
The leaked letter that Andrew mentioned actually talked about how we weren't going to meet our 2020 targets and their solutions. None of them mentioned bringing back renewable energy subsidies, I'm afraid. It was talking about, well, they kind of proposed solutions and then at the same time said, well, it's not going to work anyway. Like, they're planning an interconnector with Norway, but it's not planned to be built by 2025 or something, so that's not in time. So they sort of put forward various things and then went, but yeah, probably won't work. So what they're planning seems to revolve around is buying energy, renewable energy from other EU countries who've achieved on their target, which is allowed under the directive, the other thing was negotiating with other EU countries who are in a similar position and haven't met their targets either, for flexibility in the targets. So that doesn't sound very promising.
So no focus on the kind of internal, like you're saying, but they need to look in this, for example, Balkan, which now doesn't look like it's going to be happening. That would have been a sort of demand side, focus on demand side, and then community sourced energy, community funded energy. Yeah, I don't know what the problem is with community energy. It's just a no-brainer as far as I can see. Because in Germany they do a lot of it, and it means that you don't get the same protests against wind farms and things like that, because the community they have a stake in the projects and they understand how it works, and they don't see it as a big company coming in from outside and making money from ruining their views and that kind of thing. So
I'm afraid they're moving the other way on that too. They've just reduced the tax advantages of community energy, which they used to have. And it's I wouldn't be too optimistic of it.
Actually, it might be a little bit selfish and ask a question just came to my mind. So in the European Union, a lot of the countries are at different stages of their development. So how does the European Union want to unify the same law for countries that are at different stages of their own development?
I mean, as I understand it, at the moment there's a differentiation in terms of how the different targets are met. So some countries have much more to do, and some countries have much less to do. But I think, in particular, that it depends so much on the political makeup of the member states at the time that these targets are set. And we have a new government in Poland. I'm sorry to mention Poland again, but that will make it all the more difficult, I think, to come to a good agreement on 2030, and will affect how the targets are divvied up amongst the member states.
And we'll have one more question? No? Okay, no, so I'd just like to say thank you so much for all the speakers. Definitely great debate, different sides of the story. And thank you so much for everyone for coming and for asking questions. Just a last quick word, if you do want to get involved, and as you see on the screen, either with King's Sustainability or the King's Think Tank, you can email us. And hopefully see you in many other debates that we organize throughout the year. Thank you so much.